In 1943, a 25-mission tour of duty was required from every bomber crew member. The U.S. Army Air Corps decided that 25 missions while serving in a heavy bomber of the 8th Army Air Force would constitute a completed tour of duty because of the physical and mental strain on the crew. Statistically, there was a less than 25% chance of accomplishing that goal. Most crews never made it past their 5th mission. In 1943, the average bomber crew was expected to complete 8 to 12 missions before being shot down or disabled. U.S. Army Air Corps Major John Luckadoo was one of those who beat the averages and completed his tour of duty over Nazi-occupied Europe. His efforts are captured in a new book called Damn Lucky by friend of the channel Kevin Maurer. I recently had the opportunity for a virtual sit-down with Lucky, who is now 100 years old. His experiences as a B-17 pilot are both harrowing and heroic, and in his story live details that will make those interested in the history of World War II realize that for all the books and documentaries and movies on the subject, there's still a lot more to be told about the service and sacrifice of these brave aviators and the ground crews who supported them. So let's talk to Lucky. So what was the training pipeline for the Army Air Corps when you're going the bomber route? What airplanes did you fly along the way?
Well, during our training, of course, I flew up first and learned to fly and got my solo license on the PT-17, the Boeing Stearman Yellow Peril, as we called it. And then when we had proceeded to advance, we flew the BT-13, the Balti Vibrator, as we call that. And then ultimately, I was assigned to a multi-engine advanced school in Valdosta, Georgia, where I was captain of the class and flew Beechcraft AT-10s. And it so happened that they selected 40 of my graduating class to go to this one heavy bomber group, a B-17 group, then stationed in Kearney, Nebraska, which was about to go to overseas. They had already gone through the pre-combat training as crews and as a group. And they pulled out all of the co-pilots and stuck 40 of us, brand new second lieutenants, who'd never been in a B-17, into the right seat. Just prior to being sent overseas. This happened in no other group in the 8th Air Force, but it did happen to my group. And ultimately, out of that 40, only 4 of us managed to do a combat tour.
Let's talk about your cooling your heels in, was it Gander, waiting to do the translant, and what happened to the guy who was supposed to be the pilot, and so forth.
What happened was that since we were stuck in, we were replacing the regular co-pilots who were then checked out as first pilots and given crews and sent to other replacement groups and went overseas individually with other outfits. But we had no benefit of any pre-training and certainly had no familiarity at all with the heavy bombers, the B-17s, 4 engines, for goodness sake. And the most we had ever contended with were twin engine trainers. And so we were in the uncomfortable position of having to learn our position on the job. And therefore we were totally dependent upon our pilot to train us, not only as co-pilots, but as members of his crew, because as a co-pilot, you were second in command of the 10-man crew on a B-17. If the pilot was incapacitated for any reason whatsoever, the co-pilot became the airplane commander. And therefore, he was responsible for 9 other lives in addition to his own. And that's the way we proceeded overseas. Arriving at Newfoundland, Gander Lake, Newfoundland, in brand new aircraft with extra fuel tanks, we had to await a favorable tailwind in order to make the long hop from Gander Lake to Prestwick, Scotland, nonstop, all over water. That was in a B-17, approximately 12 and a half hours. The normal range of a B-17 was about 7 hours. We had to await the weather, and as we were doing so, the pilot of my particular crew, none of which had really fully accepted me as the substitute for their usual pilot, co-pilot, because they were very, very fond of him, and particularly the navigator and the bombardier. So as we waited there, this pilot, who was not really a warm, fuzzy type, um, he rather reluctantly gave me some opportunity to train on the aircraft, make one or two landings, and giving me some instruction as to the systems of. Basically, I had to teach myself what my position on the crew was. And he got a little bored one night, so he went across the base and proceeded to shack up with a British WAF and ended up in the hospital with a raging case of venereal disease. During war years, the only thing that they had to treat that with was sulfa. So he was flat of his back for 2 weeks, being dosed with sulfa. And as a result, the rest of the group proceeded, when the winds were favorable, to go ahead and make their long flight over to Scotland and arrive safely. None of them were lost. But we sat there as a single crew, twiddling our thumbs, playing cards, and bored stiff, waiting for the pilot to recover. Once he did and was finally released, he was so weak from having been hospitalized for 2 weeks that he couldn't stand up. And so we literally had to load him into the airplane. And he said, "Well, Lucky, I guess you're going to have to fly this bird because I can't." So I called the navigator and the bombardier together and I said, "Now you guys have never accepted me as a member of the crew, but you now have to rely upon me to get us to combat." And so I told the navigator, who was the chief instigator of my miseries, did everything in his power, as well as the bombardier, to try and discourage me from remaining on the crew, trying to force me to get a belly full of it and ask for a transfer, which I did not do. I was determined to stick it out. And so I told him that he had to navigate and he had to hit the landfall on the nose, or I would personally throw his butt out of the airplane without a parachute. So that tended to level the playing field slightly, but
Yeah, I'll bet.
It was only in the course of that flight that I think they very gradually gained any respect for my ability to meet the challenge. And when we finally arrived in England and went then to the base at Thorpe Abbotts, where we were quartered, and began flying missions immediately, because the pilot was humiliated and embarrassed and swore that he was going to fly the fastest tour in a European theater and go home. And so he volunteered us for every mission. And consequently, he did succeed in flying the fastest tour, which was over a course of 89 days.
So let's talk about your first mission. As you mentioned, this guy was very aggressive, and your pilot in command was very aggressive in volunteering for missions. So the first one was going against a U-boat facility in France. and you met pretty stiff air resistance, which led to you guys getting with Boeing and going, we got to change this airplane in terms of its ability to survive a forward quarter attack. So talk to us about that.
Well, of course, we realized instantly going against the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, that we were up against professionals. We were all just citizen soldiers. And here we're being thrown into combat against an enemy who had been fighting for nearly 4 years. The Russians on the Eastern Front, they went through the Battle of Britain against the United Kingdom, and they were pros. Also, we were confronted with an enemy, the fact that the Nazi regime had completely occupied continental Europe. When we arrived in England as a group, Axis Sally came on the radio. They had a powerful radio beam out of Berlin that was voiced by a woman who was known as Axis Sally. And she welcomed us by name, named our commanding officer and the squadron commanders that had accompanied us, and said, "You've made the biggest mistake in your lives. This is not your war. You don't have any business being here. But now that you are, we're going to teach you a lesson." Believe me, they did.
Let's quickly review for the viewers the various positions in the B-17. Obviously, pilot, co-pilot, you've mentioned the navigator. Where are the other folks in the airplane?
Okay, there are 10 members of a crew in a heavy bomber, pilot and co-pilot. In the nose was a bombardier with the Norden bomb sight. Behind him was the navigator. Behind the co-pilot and pilot in the cockpit was a top turret gunner who was the crew chief of the enlisted portion of the crew, which consisted of a radio operator gunner aft of the bomb bay, consisted of a ball turret gunner who sat in a little ball turret under the belly of the airplane with his knees up under his chin, and 2 waist gunners standing in open windows, firing single 50 caliber machine guns, and a tail gunner who had twin 50s.
What Curtis LeMay discovered in his doctrinal methodology was to fly in formation, stay in formation. So what did that formation look like? How did the pilots learn to fly these formations? And how did the Germans exploit breaking these formations up?
The formations that we used for high altitude, which was between 25 and 29,000 feet, which simply meant that in order to survive above 10,000 feet, we had to have an oxygen mask clasped over our face and have supplemental oxygen. We also had to have the engine supercharged in order to force additional air into the carburetors for the efficient burning of the fuel. And we were operating in an alien environment. The formations that we utilized were groups of 18 aircraft, 3 squadrons of 6 aircraft each, in 2 elements. You had a lead plane and a high and a low wingman in each element, had 2 elements to each squadron, and 3 squadrons in the group. And the purpose of flying in formation was mutual protection. The aircraft were staggered. One wingman was fly high, and the next wingman would fly at a lower altitude. But still, you tried to fly as close to your leader as you possibly could in order for mutual protection. This had the added danger, however, of the gunners misfiring and actually stitching one of their wingmen with friendly fire. The technique the Luftwaffe utilized, which was most effective, was to get out in front of the formation, just in line abreast. Me-109s, Focke-Wulf 190s, Me-110s, which were rocket ships, and they would fly directly through the formation, flying chicken. And the reason they attack us from that vantage point was that there was a void directly at level altitude where the top turret guns could not come down below and the ball turret guns could not come above a certain level. So in that void, they attempted to get into that slot and just fly directly through the formation, fishtailing as they did, and spraying our entire formation with machine guns, 20-millimeter cannons, and rockets. There were only 4 seconds when their guns literally bore on us and our guns would bear on them. They were so devastating, however, in perfecting that technique, and our losses were so enormously heavy that we appealed to the Boeing factory to rectify that shortcoming. And then the original aircraft that we flew across, the Model F, became a Model G, and they installed a chin turret that fired forward, twin 50s that were remotely controlled by the bombardier.
So that's a good example of industry reacting to a tactical need as the war went on. As we talk about our procurement cycles these days and how long it takes to field something, it jumped out at me how quickly Boeing responded and created the G. But in the meantime, you still had Fs that you had to fly. And so you guys were hung out there. As you mentioned, the Focke-Wulf 190 particularly was designed to go after our heavy bombers. As you also mentioned, these Luftwaffe pilots were veterans. They had been at war for some years by the time you guys showed up, and they knew how to go after, so a forward quarter slashing attack was something that they were very good at. You did this first mission against that submarine dock facility. All the airplanes survived. You get back. Was the feeling elation, or what did you realize when you got back on deck in terms of your approach to the next 24 missions?
That was, of course, our baptism of fire, our first encounter with these professionals who knew what they were doing. They were very adept at adapting new techniques in order to exploit our vulnerabilities. And because we were having to go out without any fighter escort or opposition to them in dogfighting, they relied upon their anti-aircraft, particularly near the target, to damage us sufficiently to force us out of formation. And then they, as we came off the target, they would dive on us and pick us off at leisure. So they were just darn good at what they did. They were excellently equipped and experienced, and they were fighting for their lives because they were protecting their homeland. So we knew we were playing in the big leagues, and we certainly blessed ourselves for every mission that we were able to survive, because it was basically, bottom line, just a matter of luck if you did.
So we'll just mention that the time frame we're talking about here, to your point about the Luftwaffe's capabilities, is summer 1943 and beyond, because sort of after your time in the war, the Luftwaffe was kind of destroyed, and we had more dominion than we did during your tour. You were there sort of the worst possible time with respect to the Luftwaffe's capability and this defense in depth, right? As you mentioned, you'd go through the first wave of fighters, they'd go away, and maybe you would think, oh, we're good to go. But that was the beginning of the bad part, which was now it's ack until you get over the target, and then on the way back out, now you're going against fighters again. So like 3 phases of the mission that were basically a game of survival. So the other thing that jumped out at me as I was reading some of the details of these missions was Curtis LeMay's guidance about how to deal with ACAC. And basically, his message was just suck it up, fly straight and level, because if you try to do other than that, the losses are going to be heavier than they would if you just gut it out. And we want more accuracy, because if we don't hit the targets, we're going to wind up going back again. It's all about outcomes here. And so that struck me as and oh, by the way, he led by example. He wasn't just making these orders from headquarters. He led these missions to prove his point.
Exactly. He was one of the best air war strategists that we had in the 8th Air Force, if not the best. I think he was underestimated and underrated, and it was not until the European War was over and he got sent to the Pacific as the commander of the 20th Air Force of B-29s that he really excelled and showed his abilities to the maximum. But he analyzed the attacks that the Luftwaffe made and determined, as you mentioned, that as far as the anti-aircraft was concerned, that we had no defense, no effective defense against it. If we attempted to take evasive action, we had the limitations of still having to remain in formation and not impact our wingman or people flying in our same formation. So that was so minimal that it was totally ineffective. If, however, the leader or the command pilot of the formation could detect the volleys of anti-aircraft fire that were coming up, they would box us in, and their anti-aircraft was radar controlled, so it calculated automatically our path, our direction, our altitude, and firing of the missile, and it was electrically fired. So all the anti-aircraft defenses that the Germans had just required Hitler Youth to load the darn guns. They were fired almost automatically. And if our commander in the formation could determine where that heaviest flak was coming, because from the time a missile was fired and it reached our altitude of 5 miles up, was about 45 seconds. So we could vary our course maybe a degree or a half a degree and maybe avoid that predetermined volley. So LeMay figured this out, and he said, you just fly straight and level and follow your leader, because your attempt to take any evasive action or defend yourself is useless. And he proved that by leading us and proving it in the air. He flew some of the worst missions. And so he didn't say, well, this is what I determined to be the best tactic, and you go out and prove it. He went out and proved it himself.
So one of your chapters is called You're Already Dead. And so that's kind of the attitude you got to have to fly straight and level when you have flak all around you, instead of your impulse, which is to take evasive action. So I guess there's some sort of zone you get in, in those environments. It's sort of like, okay, it's all gravy now. Whatever happens, happens. Now, you flew at least one mission, not as the co-pilot. You were the tail gunner. Talk to us about how that happened, what that experience was like, and then what happened on the backside of doing that.
They developed a policy that when your crew was designated as the lead crew of the formation. The co-pilot would be replaced by a command pilot who would be in charge of the entire formation. The pilot was continued to be the airplane commander, but his co-pilot was then in command of the entire formation. The co-pilot that he replaced then was put in the tail of the lead plane. Now you take a trained pilot out of the cockpit and put him in a tail gun position, never having fired a .50 caliber in his life, and expect him to defend the tail of the aircraft? He ostensibly was the fire control officer for the entire formation. But what the idiot that ever came up with this idea neglected to take into account was that the tail gunner had no contact with anybody else in the formation except his pilot over the intercom. And if he saw an attack coming in or saw some dangerous situation developing, as the so-called fire control officer, he would have to call the pilot, relate the facts to him. The pilot would then have to switch channels and radio to the rest of the formation. And by that time, the danger was dissipated. A different situation altogether. In my case, I'd never fired a .50 caliber in my life. The gunners had to load the guns, and they showed me how they had a little stick and pin sight to aim those twin caliber 50 caliber machine guns. But what they didn't tell me was, for Pete's sake, don't freeze on the triggers because you'll burn out the barrels, which I proceeded to do the first time we were under attack. So I sat there for that entire mission with burned out barrels, a knot on a log, and said, for goodness sake, you didn't train me to do this. You trained me to fly the blasted airplane. And to put me in the tail is asinine. So I'm not getting in the tail again. Here are my wings. You court-martial me, you do whatever you have to do, but I am not a tail gunner. So they said, okay, you'll have to sit on the ground when your crew leads the formation. And I said, I'll be glad to do that. Consequently, I did, and therefore, when that crew that I flew 21 missions with completed their 25, I, of course, still had 4 to go. And my worst mission was the following mission, my 22nd, when I went to Bremen.
So before we get to those, the balance of the missions required, just want to put a finer point on some of the things you bring up in the tail gunner position, because you and I are both tall guys. And so when you're describing what it took to cram yourself into the tail gunner station, I got claustrophobia just thinking about that. And then we were talking about the OJT, as it were, with your transland, where you know your pilot's still getting over gonorrhea, and so he's like, "You got it, right?" So hey, here we go, tailwind, fully loaded airplane. You make it to Scotland. Same drill here. You've never actually fired the gun in the tail gunner station until you're actually clearing your guns during the actual mission. Right, so you're going gimbal to gimbal, make sure you don't shoot anybody down in the process, and you're just like, oh, okay. And so this is all first-time stuff, which is amazing as we talk about the risk-averse military we have now, right? So the contrast between how you guys were doing business in the greatest conflict of all times and what we do now, it just blew me away. Also, I think you and I are kindred spirits with respect to our sort of, let's say, dogged points of view, right? So you're like, hey, guess what? I'm not doing that again, right? They're like, okay, then you're going to fall behind on the missions. You're like, okay, that's the way it is. Now, I know you didn't have a fun time sitting on the ground waiting for your crew to get back. Those are very nerve-wracking moments, as you describe. And then the way this nets out is now you're 4 missions behind. So your crew that you've been with for the first 21 flights in the mission that you've trained with, survived with, now your unit, they're out of there. And so let's pick it up with, as you mentioned, mission 22. The other thing I want to talk about is, and I can relate to this as a my time in the Tomcat, certain bureau numbers had personalities, right? So you guys named the airplanes.
Well, of course, we did tend to name our aircraft if we were assigned one as a crew. Not all crews were assigned a specific aircraft. Not all aircraft were named. Some never got names and simply went by their serial numbers. But if you had a particular aircraft and a crew chief that maintained it, you certainly were very fortunate because you understood the idiosyncrasies of that particular piece of machinery. And they did have some different characteristics, tendencies that were maybe subtle, but they nevertheless could make the difference between your understanding what you were dealing with and your ability to survive the missions. But the original aircraft that we flew overseas was named Sunny, Sunny, for the pilot's son. And on one mission, I don't recall the circumstances, but the aircraft was flyable, but we weren't. And therefore, another crew flew our aircraft and got shot down. So it didn't come back, and therefore we got another airplane assigned, and we named it Sunny 2. That was about halfway through our combat tour that occurred. But as I've previously mentioned, because I had refused to fly as a tail gunner, I was not flying every mission with my original crew. And also, due to the fact that on one mission, we had a small hole knocked out of the plexiglass nose that resulted in this very extreme cold jet stream of air directed directly on my feet, frostbit my toes. And I was in sheer agony for 5.5 hours on that particular mission. And when we landed, I had to be hospitalized and my feet thawed out, and I missed some missions in flying with my original crew as well. There was also one of the waist gunners who, due to illness, missed some missions, one mission, and he did not finish up with the original 10 men. But on the 22nd mission, the first mission I was to fly after the original crew finished up and were returned to the States, I was still a second lieutenant, same rank as I was when I graduated from flying school. And I was designated as an instructor pilot for a new crew that only had a very few missions. And we went on this mission that was briefed to Bremen, which was almost as deep into Germany as Berlin. And I was flying in the second element of the low squadron of the low group, otherwise known as the Purple Heart Corner, because that was closest to the anti-aircraft fire and was on the fringe of the formation and was subject to most of the attempts to knock us out of the formation. As we approached the target, we were under attack from the time we crossed the enemy coast. This was on October the 8th of 1943. and I was now on my 22nd mission. The other gunner from my original crew, who did not finish up with the original crew, was flying as a substitute in the plane directly ahead of me, which was leading my squadron. Aboard that plane was a pilot who was flying his 24th mission, and his co-pilot was the squadron operations officer, who is second in command of the squadron as a command pilot. So his co-pilot was in the tail of that airplane, and I was formed right on them, just underneath them, slightly as we approached the target. Normally, when our formation would approach the initial point, which would be a turning point to start on the bomb run, the enemy fighters would normally hold back and allow the anti-aircraft fire to inflict whatever damage it could in an attempt to disable us and force us out of the formation. And then they would pick us off as we came off the target. But on this particular mission, they kept flying through their own flak. That had never happened before. We'd never seen that before. They were just as much in danger of being knocked down by their own fire as we were, because they were pressing their attack so aggressively. The night before, Hermann Goering, we found out later, had threatened them. He said, "You cannot permit the heavy bombers to continue these daylight flights. And if you do, I'm going to send you to the infantry because you're not doing your duty." So, of course, they were desperate to prove to him wrong, that they were doing everything they could to knock us out of the sky. And as a result, they were pressing their attacks so aggressively that some of them ran out of ammunition. So instead of turning and going back and rearming, they flew kamikaze missions and attempted to cut the tails off of the airplane with their wings while on the bomb run. Now, when a B-17 or a heavy bomber is on the bomb run, the pilot and the co-pilot are sitting there with their arms crossed because they've turned the airplane over to the bombardier, who is literally flying the airplane through the automatic pilot attached to the bomb site in an attempt to create a level platform for the release of the bombs. He has full control of the aircraft through his bomb site. That's sheer terror. When you're sitting there and you're seeing all hell break loose and fighters are coming through the formation and the ack is coming up and it's total chaos. It's just a horrific position to find yourself in, and you wonder how in the world you ever let yourself get in that spot in the first place.
So as you mentioned, you guys are flying an unpressurized airplane upwards of 29,000 feet. You discussed some details that maybe folks had never thought about, which is, right, you guys are urinating into condoms and then tying those off, and at altitude they're freezing, and then as you descend they unfreeze, and so if somebody didn't tie it off right, then that can be kind of a mess. And you also mentioned that if you had to take a dump, you just did it in your sheepskin suit, right? Which wasn't a problem at altitude because it's frozen. But then when you get down, all of a sudden it's like, oh my God, who stinks, right? So these are sort of the details that I've never seen before. And it's the sort of grisly facts associated with what you guys were doing day in and day out. As you mentioned, hypoxia, huge threat. You're wearing O2, that those lines would sometimes freeze up. You mentioned frostbite, and you experienced frostbite. And then when you warmed up, it was painful to kick the rudder pedals, to try to land the airplane was like agonizing pain. This is the kind of thing that you were having to do just to get through a mission, never mind getting shot down by a Focke-Wulf or a Messerschmitt.
Number one, was the extreme cold that we endured at high altitude because we were unpressurized. We were operating in temperatures of minus 50 to 60 degrees below zero Fahrenheit. And that so severely impacted our ability to function and to do our jobs that it was, and you can't really convey that in a narrative form, but we did that for hours on end. And that really impacted our ability to operate. And ironically, when you're struggling to remain in formation and you're fighting the elements and you're fighting the fighters and the ack-ack, you suddenly find that you're perspiring profusely. And that perspiration freezes instantly. And the moisture in your oxygen flow becomes ice crystals. And so you're having to break those up to keep the oxygen flowing, or you're not going to survive. You do that with one hand and you fly the airplane with the other. You can't really convey that either. The other thing that I think is impossible to really adequately convey is what it feels like to be shot at. To know that there's somebody out there that is going to kill you if you don't kill them. And that horror, that realization is so petrifying. You mature overnight, you mature instantly, because you're not only concerned about your morality of what you're doing and perhaps killing someone else, but your mortality is whether you're going to survive.
So, Lucky, more than anything else, you are the embodiment of a greatest generation badass. So thank you for telling your story here today and for coming by the channel.
Well, you're quite welcome, Ward, and I appreciate the opportunity. I admire your service because, and envy you because you fighter jockeys have all the fun.
We have the fighter attack rivalry, but, you know, thank you for what you did, because the war would not have been won without the efforts of the 8th Air Force and the other Army Air Corps units that took it to them and sustained. People forget that the largest amount of casualties the U.S. military had was among aviators in the European theater. You know, we think about D-Day and different things like that, but, you know, there were, as we just mentioned, huge losses were taken. So you made it, and thanks for telling your story, Lucky, and be well.
Thank you so much, Ward. Pleasure being with you.
All right, that's going to do it for this episode. Please subscribe, like, and comment. Check the links below for merch, including details on where you can get the Punks Trilogy, my first 3 novels about life in an F-14 squadron, now available both as a Kindle and an audiobook. If you'd like to help support the channel, please consider using the super thanks, the heart icon below, or become a patron at patreon.com/WardCarroll. In the meantime, I look forward to talking to you again soon.